you're good. Sweet. So we'll go ahead and open up Arc 13. Oh, not Blender. Get my basic tempo from last time. And pretty much for the most part, we ended here for assignment 1. We talked about Illustrator and just how easy we can make Illustrator be. So hopefully you guys have already kind of picked that up. I saw, Kevin, he already came up with take 2 in like a matter of minutes, right? So it was really good to see that, and I hope you guys are starting to go, well, dang, I could use this in Studio, right? I can simply trace my site plan in Rhino, put it in Illustrator, and bam, I've got a final drawing, right? Especially for, is anybody in Cool Bars right now? Yeah, she's doing like this little pocket park thing, already asking for a site, design inside of it. So, I mean, that could be something easily, Manny, that you draw that site, print it out, and you can draw right on it, right? And now it's already to scale. You already know some of the measurements, and you know that it's accurate. You can print it to any scale. You don't have to do that anymore, right? You don't have to draft, of course, everything. But in that regard, let's go to assignment 2. Like I was saying, it's much like it, but really the three-dimensional commands. And I do like to throw out there, this is kind of a new thing that I've been doing. For extra credit, if you can make one of these, totally an extra 10 points, right? Just to kind of practice some things. We're going to go over tons of different things commands basically you can use today. Obviously that's just kind of extra, but if you're just absolutely bored, right, and you've maybe even done some of this stuff before, I'd urge you to maybe do the extra credit. Try and make one of these just by looking at it, which is definitely a great skill in architecture. I can't tell you how many times I draw something and then I'm like, how do I make this in the computer, right? And the answer to that is to practice, right? To start putting these things together. But at least for today, really the same things. Create the 2025 box. We're going to apply 3 subtractions in a certain axis. We're going to apply 3 additions and certain ones. Lastly, we're going to create a 30 by 30 surface, right? And it's going to be, I'm going to show you a couple surfaces because honestly that's one of my favorite things to make. And then we're going to show a simple diagram, but only 3 steps. So I think last time there was maybe 3 or 4 steps. You could have gone a little bit more and extra. But at least in this one, I want to strive you to go even less. Can you make that make sense with even less steps to talk about? So a little bit of challenges, and again, throwing us right into the pool. So in that regard, let's just get started. I like to do this similar thing, but I'm not going to do that all over again. So I'm just going to copy what I want. In my case, I'm going to make sure that I get all these pieces. I'm going to copy. Oh, looks like I have something on lock. Yep, definitely have something on lock. And it looks like I accidentally changed my line type too. And so I should probably change that. But as you can see, it's kind of in a dash line. It tries to tell you that it's dashed now, but it is what it is. I can always hold shift and add to my selections. Not too shabby. And go ahead and copy, just because I know I'm going to want to keep my steps. And to be fair, you can make a new Rhino file, but I like to keep stuff in the same file, keep everything organized, and go from there. Step 1, box, type box. Very simple there. I'm going to go with 25 feet by 25 feet, 25 feet, enter. And I know I won't be able to see it here, but 25 feet, enter. And of course, it'll solidify that box. I'm going to, of course, double check it. And to be fair, this might start getting in the way, so I might move it off to the side. And type hide. That way, I don't even have to use any processing power in terms of, while I work. Let's see, secondly, it says apply 3 subtractions of space to the box, only in the X and the Y axes. So in my case, the subtractions could be a few things, but maybe let's read the operations as well. For our next exercise, we'll be looking deeper into the 3D commands that can utilize the architecture design abstraction. The point of this exercise is to practice modeling, but also refers to our learning skills of Design 1 composition. For this exercise, we will focus less on the process and more on the product of the object itself, using Boolean operations, sweep 1, sweep 2, pipe, network surface, lofts, and polycurves. We set out to make a spaciously interesting compositional object. Follow the step-by-step instructions to again show the step-by-step order of operations and to ensure efficiency of modeling workspace, right? So again, it's pretty vague, and in our case it says only in the X and the Y. So maybe the first thing that I need to understand is that, well, going up is the Z axis, right? And our X and our Y are basically face down, right? Almost like a planar view. So in my case, I'll be coming in from the sides, making some subtractions. Now, to be fair, there's a lot of things we can do here. I mean, it just says subtractions. So in my case, immediately what comes to mind is some sort of, maybe not necessarily a wire cut, but maybe a Boolean subtraction or a Boolean difference, which of course difference meaning subtraction as well. You may notice that in that little box that we have, and I know on Windows sometimes it's actually here, sometimes it's actually up here. But if you right click on these things, there's actually a number of tools out of them. And then if you right click again, there's even more ways to make each of those shapes in a different way. In my case, I'm going to start simple by just, doing a cylinder, right? Probably should make a copy first since it's part of step 2. So we'll go ahead and do that. In my case, it says how many subtractions? 3. Awesome. So in my case, let's subtract from it. Now, as you guys know, you could grid it up too, and use those as subtraction. We could just start subtracting from it. In my case, I do want to show you a couple more operations. And again, it's not so much about what the product looks like at the end. In my case, I can make a cylinder, right? And of course, use all my views to make that cylinder. In my case, that seems like a pretty fair subtraction, that I can eventually get involved. I'm going to go ahead and zoom selected. That way, again, when I rotate, now it's a little bit more focused on the object in question. So I don't know, maybe that's subtraction 1. That looks like it's going to be kind of nice. And it's compositional, right? Maybe I actually do want it to be pretty perfect, so maybe I move it. And maybe I want my center point. That way I can lock onto my center point. You'll see that it's now on the center of that circle. And I can lock it onto certain parts of my object. I can further use Gumball to, of course, manipulate that. And that's looking pretty square. I could even still further use Gumball and change the object as well, right? I mean, don't get too funky with the spices, but, like I said, it's not so much about the composition of it all. I don't know, maybe that's what I want right there. So maybe that's number 1. Let's make another shape. I'm going to go with, a pyramid. And actually I can control the amount of this pyramid. So in our case, it says pyramid, but you can actually do a number of sides that you want. So I'm going to go with 3 sides actually. Sweet. And then of course I can decide the height of it. Not too shabby. So play around with the shapes, right? I mean, might as well test some things. But in my case, I do want to be a little bit more calculated about it. So in my case, I am lining it up using my O snap to my object, right? And then of course, further moving it. So don't get me wrong, we could just like move stuff like this, but be very careful because, well, again, in perspective, when you move it, you might have thought you moved it that way, but as you can see, it was more of an optical illusion going on there. I definitely did not mean to move it away from the object. So again, Gumball and your axes, right? That red, green, and blue. So in my case, I do want to make sure that I don't take it away from, I'm trying to work on, this level plane. So that's definitely what I mean by the X and Y axes. What I'm trying not to affect is the Z, the top, and the bottom, right? Eventually I'm going to use some pipes and stuff in step 3 to, of course, subtract that. But it's looking pretty good so far. That's number 2. Let's get one last one. And let's make a shape of our own, right? I mean, why not? I can start off with a regular curve or polyline. And in my case, I'll make sort of a bean shape. I'll close my object And I could even click on it again and further manipulate it as well. So again, we got to play around with what this program does. We'll make a heart since it's close to Valentine's Day, right? And another operation that we can use is called extrude, right? So when you type extrude, it's going to bring up a couple of options. You can actually extrude a lot of things, but in our case, we started off with a curve. So we'll select extrude curve. When we do that, we'll press enter. And of course, as you can see, it extrudes it really on the axis that it was created on, right? Fairly simple. So in our case, we have a couple of options. I can keep it solid, I can go both sides, and I can delete the input. Don't really need all of those, but in my case, I do want to make sure it's solid. That way I can subtract these two pieces. I'll make sure that it's solid, and my other objects are pretty fat, so I'm going to do something a little skinnier. And right away, we have our little heart bean shape piece. I can further manipulate it, but again, I just want to stay in that X and Y axis. I don't know, maybe I come hard at an angle, or simply just see what it looks like slicing into the piece. It may not actually do much, but that curvilinear piece might be something of an effect that we want. So again, there's my three pieces, and again, you don't have to use my pieces, right? I do want you to at least experiment with this. Maybe I want this curve later, maybe I don't. I don't know. Maybe I'll save it off in step 2, because again, I don't think I could draw that exactly the same way that I did in the moment. So that's looking pretty good. Let's go ahead and actually do the operation. So I may need that later for the diagram, so I'm just going to make a copy. When in doubt, make a copy. I can't tell you how many times I'm about to do something big to my design, right? And I'm like, crap, it didn't work out. And then I don't want to sit there and make my whole design again, right? So when in doubt, of course, make a copy. But let's go ahead and do those. I'm also going to get this out of the way so it's not confusing. We'll put that somewhere less important, and I'll hide it just to save some CPU as well. Let's go ahead and perform those operations though. So in my case, I want to subtract from this piece, and I think you'll see a couple of things that either may work or may not work. In this scenario, you might see that my bean piece, if you will, is both going out, in, and out again, and back into the object, right? Sometimes that works, especially if it's a fairly less complex object. Sometimes it doesn't work because of how complex the surface is. Let's test it out though, right? For instance, in some cases it might actually be way too small, right? So for instance, something like that might not work because, well, it's just not cutting enough into the box. Whereas if I push it a little bit more, it might actually have a little bit more success, but now less successful over here. Anyway, let's test some stuff out, and there's definitely a reason why I wanted to make a weird object, just in case you make a weird object. So in my case, I know I'm going to subtract from the box, so I'm going to start off with clicking on it first and typing in Boolean difference. I'll hit enter, and in my case it already knows which one I want to subtract from, so now it says select the surfaces or polysurface to subtract with. In my case, I can't actually do all three at once, since I'll be subtracting from the same object. I'll hit enter, and voila, architectural project massing model number 1, right? Can you imagine just doing this for studio, right? You're coming up with a skyscraper design, you're coming up with the mass model about how, people want to be entered into the building and whatnot. But already right away, I've made a model that honestly would take me hours to build by hand. To be fair, I don't really like what's going on here spatially, but it did work, so fair enough, right? I kind of got this little skylight thing going on. Again, I'm not trying to be too architectural yet, but definitely not bad. I want to save that. It's looking pretty good, and again, I might have to use that for my diagram, so I may just kind of want to leave that there. It looks like I've already accidentally moved it a little bit. Oh, never mind. That's just looking really big. Anyway, that's looking pretty good. So let's take that. I'm going to copy it. Another trick that I like to show my students is we can copy from a certain area. So I know I usually just kind of click anywhere, but in my case, I might be wanting to get an exact spot to an exact piece. So I'm going to pick a familiar corner, and I'm going to use another familiar corner. And what's nice about that is now that I have these two pieces in the exact same spot in relation. And it's just because I use that copy piece. Welcome. Moving on. I'm gonna hopefully get into the Illustrator part today, but I forgot. When I do the surfaces, I do a lot of different surfaces. But already right there, we've already made some solid shapes and learned that we can draw a shape and make any shape that we want, right? To be fair, you can also extrude two different objects in two different ways and then slice them and make it a completely different object that doesn't even exist. In fact, some of you guys, have you ever heard of a platonic solid? You know, Plato, who came up with the 5 platonic solids, the cube, the tetrahedron, the octahedron, the dodecahedron, right? These 5 platonic solids that of course derive from math and are said to be the primary objects or the primary 3D objects. Well, they came up with one quite recently in 2023 called the chestahedron, and it's actually a 7-sided piece that has 7-sided objects of all the exact same size, and it happens to resemble your heart. Kind of interesting. So I'm just saying not everything has actually been discovered, and thanks to the math and the digital modeling of some of these programs, we're even making new discoveries of different platonic solids, and I'm sure there's actually even more. Anyway, however, I thought it was quite interesting. Step 3, apply 3 additions. So we're going to add to it. In our case, that immediately tells me I'm going to use Boolean union, right? I'm going to actually put these pieces together, and I'm going to put it to the thing that I've already subtracted from. However, it says pipe-like object, so I do want to go over, you know, we use a lot of columns, we use a lot of beams in architecture, so it probably would make a lot of sense to go over some of the ways that we can make those things, or at least 3D model them very simply. In my case, let's make a couple first. So the easiest one is to make simply a line, right? That's pretty simple. Fair enough. I'm going to try another one and show you guys, of course, a curve. So I would still consider this a pipe-like object, right? It's pipe-like, right? I can't tell you how many times I've wanted to use wire in a design or show something of a structure that's maybe a little bit more curvilinear or fluid rather than just straight lines all the time. That we're familiar with in Design 1 and Design 2. And lastly, I'm going to get funky with the spices and show you, well, you can kind of almost do anything, right? So don't get me wrong, that's still technically pipe-like, right? Is it going to cause some problems when we try to subtract? I hope so. That way I can show you what to do, right? Just in case you're being extra creative. In my case, it's pretty simple though. We'll start off easy, and I'll refocus on my pieces. But one of the first things is called pipe. I know, it's quite easy. We just type in pipe, enter, and we basically decide a radius of that pipe at the beginning and a radius of that pipe at the end. So in my case, maybe I want it to be 12 inches, enter, and it's going to ask me where do I want it to end, 12 inches as well. And for the most part, you'll kind of get the idea that, well, it's basically a cylinder. And there's a couple ways to make that too, right? To be fair, we could also do it many different ways. So if I do pipe, I could do something really small, right? So like say 3 inches to something that's like 24 inches. And it's not exactly a cone, right? You guys kind of see it's more like a buoy, right? It's sort of actually even adding that curve to it. To be fair, that would actually be really hard to like loft and, you know, to make those kinds of shapes. And I use that stuff all the time when, I don't know about you, but there's a specific project called Centre Pompidou in France, Paris, made by Renzo Piano. That's probably one of my favorite projects of all time. And it uses kind of interesting structure. Maybe I should put structure. Where we see, you know, all these different little shapes, and man, you can't even really see it in that photo. Oh, we might be able to see it here. Yeah, some definitely funky shapes and some definitely different pipes of different sizes, and actually changing those sizes, going from big to another. So we use this stuff all the time. And I don't know about you, but all I can think of is like, how would I model this in Rhino? And in fact, one of the first classes I ever taught in computer graphics I made a huge mistake, and I was like, everybody pick your favorite precedent. Let's try and make that precedent in Rhino. Big mistake. All right, you know, poor Ellis over there. He'd be like, crap, this is not the way to learn Rhino. So we do have to start small, but I like to give you the end goal too. I mean, why do we even practice all these little different things? And it's so that we can eventually model the thing that hasn't been modeled yet. So there's obviously a lot of things we can do to prepare for that. The next command that we can use is called sweep. Now you'll notice if you type in sweep, it actually has a couple of options. You have sweep 1 and sweep 2. I think we'll just focus on sweep 1 today. Honestly, sweep 2 is kind of confusing. Anyway, in my case, it's actually going to need 2 pieces. So I need a rail is what this is going to ask for, and a profile, right? And basically it's going to sweep this profile according to that rail. So in my case, let's say my rail's like really crazy. I don't know about you, but I can already like imagine a roof structure that maybe looks like this or has some kind of part like that, and that would be pretty sweet. How many of you guys have heard what an I-beam is, right? Know what an I-beam is? Took maybe Tech 1 or Tech 2. Maybe you're in it right now. Well, let's draw that profile real quick. In fact, I could probably even download all the profiles that would actually be, you know, these architectural profiles. But for the sake of conversation, let's go ahead and make a profile. So in my case, I'm going to use a different view and just kind of make it off to the side. You'll notice that it's going to build it over here because that, again, that's where that plane of existence is. So let's just draw it kind of in freeform space, and I'm just going to kind of fake it till I make it. Of course, please be accurate more than, you know, I am, just trying to save time. But for the most part, I'm just going to make a simple I-beam. I'm going to use my smart tools and kind of line up with, you know, existing pieces and just kind of fake it till I make it. No, it's not a perfect I-beam, but it'll work for today. And in my case, I hope you guys can see how I'm using this Smart Track tool, right, and how it's kind of trying to help me line that up. I know I make that look really easy, but it takes a lot of practice, right? However, we got a closed profile, and the last thing that we need to do is make it a little bit closer. And as you can see, it's right here, and I can drag it all the way to this pole. I do want to make it at least touch in some way, right? So as you can see, it's touching at the top, but maybe not necessarily touching in the side view yet. So let's double check that. And yeah, it's definitely not yet. So I'm gonna scoot it down a little bit, maybe rotate a little bit, and make sure that, of course, they're touching. And as you can see, they're pretty dang close. So let's type in sweep 1. It's going to ask me for the rail. Awesome. Click on it. It's going to ask me for the sweep shapes. In my case, usually it says profile, and in Rhino 7 it might say profile as well. I'm going to click on the shapes. In fact, you can, in sweep, you can use multiple shapes. So if you wanted to go from an I-beam to a circle, heck, I don't know why you would, but you could, right? I'm going to hit enter. It's going to ask for a direction. That's not usually important. Keep in mind you can move this around too, just in case you get a really weird shape and it's not working. If you click on it as well, it'll actually go the other way. So in my case, I'm going to hit sweep, and as you can see, it made probably the funkiest I-beam you've ever seen, right? But we can, right? We can model stuff like that. To be fair, if I asked you to do this physically, how would you do it, right? You'd probably have to get some basswood. You'd probably have to get it all hot. You'd have to like bend it up into shape. And no, professor, I need this exact shape. Well, hell, how am I going to do that, right? And of course, we can use this modeling technology to of course make these things. Anyway, there's pipe number 2. Let's try it again with something maybe even more complex, right? Usually you don't want an intersection of your points, so in my case, I'm going to select some of my points and move one down, maybe move one up, again, so that there's not an intersection of points. Hopefully that makes some sense. But let's try another way. In my case, let's make a funny shape, maybe a hexagon. I use hexagons all the time. And I can make stuff in 2D as well and then just rotate it, right? I mean, why work harder when we can just work smarter? You guys may have also noticed it basically retained that angle too. So if you wanted it to be a little bit more congruent, for instance, same thing's gonna happen here. It's gonna follow it based on that same sort of perpendicular angle. So if I rotate it to be somewhat perpendicular to the rail, it's going to be a lot closer. And to be fair, we could get that in a little bit more, right? I mean, I could actually make a 90-degree angle here, and we can get that angle. In fact, I think you can just type in angle, and we can actually find the angle between two parts. Anyway, in my case, it's probably not going to work because I'm in the top view and it's not two lines. But another thing, bless you, is you'll notice that that red arrow is the perpendicular of whatever my shape is, and I could, fake it till I make it and get it pretty close. If it's a curve, yeah, I'm never going to find a perfect tangent anyway, but I can get it pretty close, and it is touching. So let's go ahead and sweep it again. In my case, I could start off with the rail, but I don't want to confuse you too badly, so we're just going to type in sweep 1, enter. When it asks for the rail, we'll click on the rail. When it asks for the selected sweep shapes, we'll select that. Then we'll hit enter, enter again, and of course it's going to make a crazy shape. Now, in sweep, I didn't even go over this, but we can close the sweep, and as you can see, it's trying to preview for us, and it doesn't look like we're going to close it. And what it means by close is basically go from here to there and close it. So what it's telling me right now is, dude, that's not possible. There's no way you're going to close this shape, right? So I'm going to unclose it, and as you can see, pretty wild, right? And it is already intersecting with each other. That's not going to work if I want to use that to subtract from another object, because again, what's crazy about this digital space is we can break the laws of physics in this program, right? So just because we can make it in Rhino doesn't mean we can, of course, make it in reality. So I may need to cancel that and actually move my shape a little bit more, right? So maybe move my points a little bit more and get them a little bit closer, or sorry, not closer, but farther away from each other. So in my case, I'll make them a little farther and maybe actually make my shape a little smaller as well. For the sake of this exercise, it could be a lot smaller because, well, I'm not doing anything to scale and I'm not really having to make anything yet. So sweep 1, enter, rail, shape, enter, and eventually you get really fast at this stuff too, right? I know I kind of go slow to make sure we get it, but not too shabby. So already right there, we got some 3 pipes, and let's just make sure we need to add them to this piece. Now that's going to look funky. It's going to look like, in my case, like crazy rebar. You don't have to make crazy objects like I'm doing today. If you want to make it all 3 straight pipes or all 3 curved pipes, I think that would be really fine. But wanted to throw some options in there that there's not just, of course, one way to do something. So let's add it to it. And in our case, it says X, Y, or Z. So it's like free form. You can do, of course, whatever we want in terms of adding those. In my case, I'm going to try all 3 just to kind of show you what happens. So I'm going to, use that one there, use that one here, and use that one there. I'm going to make a copy because I definitely don't want to do that again. So I'm going to copy it. And again, kind of make a 3.2. Again, just in case I might need it or might not. And then let's go ahead and apply those. So I don't know about you, but that's probably not very interesting yet. So maybe we move this one up. I don't know, maybe it comes right through that space. I hope it works. We'll see what that does. I may need to right click and of course put it in like an X-ray or a ghosted. That way I can actually see what's maybe going on. I may even need to change the colors or keep track of my layers. For instance, I may even want to say new layer, step 3 pipes. Again, the more organized that I am in Rhino, you guys probably quickly saw, I know Kevin quickly realized this, right, that Illustrator has a way of breaking all the pieces, right, immediately, right, and it destroys your layers very quickly. Some of you guys may have realized that too, especially if you take that AI file or that DWG and almost drag it to another Illustrator file, it loses sometimes that information. But in my case, I may need it just to see better, right? So in my case, I'm going to, select a blue. I'm going to select my pieces that I want to change. I'm going to right click on my layer and change object layer. It's immediately going to turn blue, and you immediately know that, we can turn those things off too to make certain things easier. In my case, I'm just going to fake it till I make it for the sake of tutorial and get some objects in there. And again, we need to add them. So, I want to add something, somewhat a little bit spatial. I'm sorry, this one's going to look real funky. You do not have to use an I-beam, by the way, right? You can use an HHS beam, which is more like a rectangle beam, which is what we're usually more surrounded with. Usually you don't see the I-beam so much unless like you have exposed trusses or things like that. But let's manipulate our pieces a little bit. And some of you guys may have noticed already, it kind of does a trick on your eyes. When you're looking at stuff, you start to see things sort of the other way or vice versa. And it really is just good practice to do. That's looking pretty good. That one's looking pretty good. Honestly, I'm going to get rid of this I-beam because that's just going to look too funky for me. I'm going to go ahead and copy this one, and that would be fine too. I don't know, maybe I have something quite regular about it. But let's see what happens when we try to add them. And maybe I actually go completely through. So another thing that I forgot to mention is that you can reset Gumball, right? So if you may notice when you have Gumball enacted, there's like this little white circle, and there's a special menu in it. If you click on it, there's actually a couple of things we can do. We can reset, relocate Gumball, just in case your object ever gets kind of really crazy. I just want to throw that out there. That may be something to work with. In my case, let's maybe change that up a little bit. And I have my 1, 2, and 3 pipes to add. In my case, I know that it's going to be Boolean union. So I'm going to select my overall object. I'm going to type in boo and scroll down to Boolean union. It's going to ask me which polysurface do you want to add all together. So I'm going to add that piece, that piece, that piece. And actually, in my case, it looks like it didn't catch that first one. So I'm going to make sure that piece is in there and press enter. As you can see, it immediately all turned blue, indicating that it actually became one layer and became one piece. That's actually a good sign. It tells me that it actually worked. For instance, if one of these basically stayed the same color, or you'll notice that if you click on it and it doesn't highlight the whole thing, then it probably didn't work. All right, let's use that piece. Go ahead and copy. Again, I don't want to do that all over again. And I guess I should change my messages, that way I don't confuse anybody or even myself in the future. Last but not least, and similar to what I just did, probably one of my favorite things, let's make some surfaces. And in this case, there are some stipulations. For instance, it needs to be a 30 by 30 unique surface to slice through the object. And what I mean by unique surface is, well, I don't want you to just have like a flat surface. I mean, how lame is that? I mean, especially when you can make so many different ones. One of my favorite tools of all time is, of course, a surface from 3 or 4 points. In fact, I think you have to completely type that in, by the way, like surface from, oh, by the way, you can't use enter, right? Yeah, so surface from 3 or 4 points. To be fair, I've eventually just realized, you can use this all the time. But in my case, what's nice about it is I can essentially click anywhere and it's going to create a surface for me out of 3 or 4 points. What's even greater about that is if I hit function F10, I can actually use the control points, and I can simply make, there's my roof design. Boom, done. Sorry, I don't know why, I guess I hit my function key. But I don't know about you, but there's a 1950s project from Le Corbusier, his International Pavilion, where he quite literally made this, and I just made it in 2 seconds. Right? So technology has really come a long way, if you ask me. But at least there's one way to make a surface. And to be fair, it's not exactly going to cut or dice anything yet, but there's at least step 1. So again, 3 to 4 point surface. Now, the stipulation is, well, it needs to be a 30 by 30. So I may want to actually draw a rectangle first and make sure that it is 30 feet, enter, by 30 feet, enter. And the reason for that is so that, well, it at least covers our object. However, if you use crazy pipes like I did, you may need a little bit of a bigger surface, and that'll be up to you. And we'll see if we need that along the way. I'm going to go ahead and make my surfaces basically out of it. That way we can at least see it a little bit better. In my case, again, I could use 3 or 4 points. I do want to click those in order, by the way, right? So notice when I click them in order, it actually does make something correct. However, if I do those points out of order, so if I go across and I go over here and then I cross it, it makes a quite different surface, and it's because it's actually reading those in a 1, 2, 3, 4 manner, right? However, there's definitely more ways we can make surfaces. One of my favorite tools is actually a loft, so L-O-F-T. In my case, I just want to make a curve real quick. I'm going to make that basically here. So I'm just going to get kind of fancy with the spices, a couple of points, and I'm basically using this rectangle to control that, right? So I'm going to use this piece, and I know it looks really funky. It looks like it's 3D, but it's actually flat. So I'm going to use my gumball and rotate it 90 degrees. That's looking pretty cool. I mean, I don't know about you, but I come up with crazy roofs all the time. I'm going to go ahead and copy it. I'm going to use my rectangle to, of course, put that on the other side. And immediately, well, I mean, there's a couple ways. Hi, guys. There's a couple ways I can make a surface out of this. I already showed you before, we can use extrude, right? So if I type in extrude, I mean, don't get me wrong, it makes a perfect surface. And, you know, that may be or may not what I want. I mean, don't get me wrong, it makes a pretty cool roof and things like that, but, you know, I might want some more detail or some undulation. For instance, maybe I want it to go from sort of this wiggly line to something a little bit more uniform. So in my case, maybe something like that. Maybe like a bow or like a rainbow. In my case, again, I make it in 2D first and then I just rotate it, right? I'll type in move, click my point, and select the point that I want to move it to. So in my case, as you can see, I'm kind of building a wireframe, if you will. But I can't just extrude this to there, right? In fact, if I choose both and type extrude, it's gonna just make both, and that maybe isn't what I want. So the next thing that I can use is loft. So I'll use this piece and that piece. I'll type in loft, enter, and it'll do its best to actually create the shape between those, right? Immediately making something almost, I mean, I don't know how many of us are making drapes in architecture, but as you can see, this would be the greatest way of making just a simple drape, right? Or, for instance, a highly complex roof. And maybe I'm getting a little too ahead of myself in terms of the complexity. Let's simplify it a little bit. And in fact, I could really simplify it and just delete some points, right? Not a big deal there. And that's a little bit more simplified. Let's try that again. Type in loft, boom. And that's very realistic to something that I might actually do in studio, right? Especially for a pavilion or, again, a roof or a wall or, you know, what have you, right? We no longer are bound by just orthogonal objects, and we can definitely use curvilinear elements. But that's looking pretty good. You'll also notice there's quite a few options in there. Quite a few options that will blow up your computer, by the way. For instance, if I rebuild it, I can make it actually a very smooth object, right? So for instance, I can tell the computer I want 100 lines instead of just 10 lines there. And you can see that it immediately gets a lot of lines, right? A lot more surfaces. Technically, there is no such thing as a curve. Go figure. They call all the lines curves, and there's nothing that's actually curved. When it comes to three-dimensional space, what it is actually a bunch of flat surfaces, of course, making those up. Because, well, to be fair, even your screen is built out of an X and Y pixelated system. How would it show you a curve? Have you guys ever noticed in AutoCAD when you see a curve or zoom in? It's actually all pixelated. It's a calculation. It's a projection of that curve. Anyway, probably more science than we need today, but let's continue. We're almost there. About 20 minutes left. Right. So we went over loft. And, you know, before I can slice something, I may actually want it to be a surface. So, for instance, right now, surfaces don't do much, and if I type in what, it's definitely a valid surface. In fact, it even says geometry, valid surface. But a valid surface isn't going to cut from a solid object. And if I type in what, it's going to even tell me a valid poly surface. So it's multiple pieces, and it's actually composed of 112 surfaces. Go figure. I mean, that's pretty crazy. If you ever need to know those numbers, guys, just type in what. I can't tell you, at least in the professional world, when they go, okay, we're going to have to pay $5 per surface area, I can calculate that and go, look, principal architect. This is actually going to range estimate cost us about this much. And again, he's like, how did you know that? And I'm like, don't worry about it, right? And you look good, right? You start to look like the man or woman in the room that knows what's going on. So that's always a plus. However, we might need to apply some thickness to it. So I'm going to click on my surface and offset surface. So just like a regular 2D offset, I can't just do offset, but you'll see that it says offset surface. When I click on that, you'll see that there's some arrows. It's asking, do I want to offset it down or do I want to offset it up? If I click on the outside, or sorry, on the surface, it'll actually switch those arrows. So in my case, now it's going offset out. Maybe I want it to be very thin, and I just want it to be a distance of 1 inch. So I'll type in 1 inch, enter, and I'll make it a very thin surface, right? In my case, it got those numbers. Awesome. Enter again. And as you can see, it's a 1 inch thick surface. Pretty sweet. That I can Boolean difference because now it's technically an object. Let's go over one last way. And again, probably another great tool that's one of my favorites is called a network surface. Now, the way a network surface works is, well, I need 4 curves, right? So just to kind of show you how that works. And we'll do something kind of funky with the spices. I mean, why not? We can now. Let's keep it straight this time. Let's keep it at least orthogonal. And shoot, I'll even make it congruent. So in my case, I want 4 copies of this, so I'm going to copy it. I'm going to use that piece. Actually, I should probably rotate it first. So again, I'm going to rotate it 90 degrees. And it's going to be actually too big. So let's maybe take that back just a little bit. So basically, I'm just raising and lowering it. And I mean, why work harder if we don't have to? I'm going to copy it. Oh, it doesn't look like it's actually lined up, so I'm going to move it first. And make sure that it's on that piece, right? I'm going to go ahead and copy. And put one on the other side. I'm going to go ahead and mirror it. Because, I mean, a mirror is another way that, you know, I can work a little bit smarter. And I can use the diagonal to get the other side. You guys saw that? I get all 4. I get the exact same shape. Now that's a pretty weird roof if you ask me. But I'm going to go ahead and take all 4 pieces and I'm going to type in network surface. Enter. And voila. It's going to magically put those all together. And as you can see, a pretty unique design that, to be fair, I don't even know where I'd start if I had to make that by scratch, right? So again, we can use these surface tools. And to be fair, there's some options in this too. Like you can leave certain ones loose, or you know, one to have a tangency, and you can kind of play around with the effects of what those actually do. But for instance, it starts to basically mess with the way that they connect to each other, right? Usually, I prefer the actual position, just because it'll make it a little less loose. But again, you can control a lot more to this. I'm going to go ahead and press OK, and I'll probably use this surface today to cut through my last step. I know, all of that just to kind of go over surfaces, but it is important, and I got to tell you, I use surfaces all the time in architecture. So I'm going to go ahead and offset that surface. Enter. And just so that we can see it a little bit better, I'm going to use 3 inches. Enter. You have to hit enter twice for some reason, I guess because there's a little bit more few options. But already we have a 30 by 30 surface, and lastly we just need to cut it. So I've already got to copy it over here, so I don't know, for the sake of diagramming, I may actually want to show where it is and where I'm cutting from or trimming from, as you'll see soon. But let's make sure we're cutting it the right way. Lastly, create a 30 by 30 unique surface and slice the object in 2 pieces. Well, that's all it says. Select it in 2 pieces. It doesn't say X, Y, or Z. So in my case, I may need to find the right one, right? So let's find the right one. In my case, I might need to rotate this around a little bit and see maybe what kind of 2 pieces that I'm actually going to achieve or get out of this. I may need to actually make it a little bit bigger, and that's okay too, especially if you got some really long pipes going on, right? But let's take a look. So far, not quite 2 pieces yet. So let's move it in a little bit more. and not too shabby, but as you'll see, I may need to actually make this a little bit bigger. For instance, I was going over this last time. This is going inside the blue object, outside the blue object, and inside the blue object again. So let's see if it actually works, and I have a feeling it won't, especially because, well, it's not even exiting the object. So again, how is it supposed to make it into two? It's not going to like help you, right? It's going to be like, no, you're not exiting the object. I don't know what the two objects that you want, right? So in my case, I might have to fake it till I make it a little bit and make it a little bit bigger, right? That way, I know that it's actually completely exiting the object, just like wire cut or some of the other operations where, right? It's both going in and out of the object. That might not work either because, well, it's technically not two pieces. So I may need to move it up a little bit, and that's okay. Sweet. But at least from what I can tell, for the most part, it seems to be exiting on all four pieces. And let's go ahead and Boolean difference. So I may want to copy that again, just in case so I don't lose it. I mean, what's the harm? You're never going to harm yourself for too many copies. So let's go ahead and try and Boolean difference it. So we'll take that piece. Well, there's two things you can actually do. Trim also works on three-dimensional objects. And of course, we still have Boolean split. So let's try both. In my case, I'm going to try trim first, T-R-I-M. Once I do that, it's going to say, okay, which side do you want to trim? In my case, I'm going to try this side, and voila, it worked. You guys saw that? It's almost too quick. Let's try it again. I'm going to click on the object I want to trim with, type in trim, enter, and again, select the side that you want to get rid of. So in my case, I'm going to try that side. Works out perfectly. Again, the reason I made a copy is how in the world am I going to get that back or show that I'm exploding maybe two different crazy pieces, right? So I may actually, for instance, get rid of this one and get rid of the other one, right? So again, I'm going to make another copy just in case, I need it again. Always good habits, right? Let's try trim again and get rid of the other side. Sweet. So that tells us that the object is going completely through the object and it's able to trim. Now, I do want to show you when it doesn't work, but I do want to get those two pieces because they do look pretty cool. Right? The surface itself is really just so that we can do that. But the idea is, well, we have actually a wholly object going on here, right? And actually we don't have an object at all, right? So, I mean, there's a couple of ways to do this. We could cap an object and, not like in the sense of like stop the cap, but actually cap it as in like put a closure on it. And you'll see that it's unable to cap. It's a crazy object. There's no way the computer's like, I have no idea what you actually want to be closed or open, right? So in my case, actually Boolean split might be the best way to go. So good thing I made a copy. And in fact, I'll make another copy. Because why not? So let's try Boolean split. In my case, I'm going to take the object in question. I'm going to type in Boolean split, enter, and select my red object. In my case, Boolean split sometimes asks for both objects, so let's try that. I'm going to hit enter, and bam! It's going to use that object now to actually slice it up. So if I move this out of the way, you'll actually see there's actually three things in here. So there's a piece, and there's actually the piece that was actually missing, if you will, from the others. Does that make sense? Right, there's that kind of missing piece we're looking for. Again, the reason I explain this, guys, is I won't always be there behind your back, right? Being able to help, or to be fair, even sometimes explaining these things to somebody is like, I don't even know how to tell you what I'm doing, right? I'm trying to close this object, if you will, right? But again, Boolean split is a little bit more forgiving because, well, it's going to solve some of those issues for us. If I go into like a rendered view, you should be able to kind of see what I'm talking about, right? It's definitely a closed object now. Whereas, well, if you take a look at the other ones we did, they won't actually be a closed object. Well, I kind of put that one on there. But as you can see, it's very open. That's definitely not what we want. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's probably pretty cool for an art student, but it's got holes, it's got all these anomalies that we don't necessarily need. We definitely want to see what this last piece is, right? That way we can maybe even diagram that these pieces are even supposed to go together, and this one comes down and slices into it. Now, to be fair, I have about 6 minutes left, and as you can imagine, diagramming this is going to be fun, right? There's so many options, which is why I was saying now is the time to refine it. Do we simply show actually the addition and subtractions, maybe at the same time, maybe all in the same little square? Do we even start off with the box anymore? Maybe we actually start off with the subtractions that we started off with, right? Maybe it might be enough information already, or maybe we make that really tiny and we make it part of our logo. I don't know, right? But for the most part, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and arguably 6 steps that we can start to diagram with, right? So it'll be definitely up to you to basically decide which ones we want to work with. In my case, for the sake of argument, let's just come up with the 3. So just like we did our 11 by 17, and that looks like 11 by 17, but I'm not actually sure. So I'm going to use my, I don't know, one of my layers. I thought I made a layer that actually, yeah, my organizing layer. There we go. I'm going to double click on that. I'm going to click rectangle. And again, I can use any ratio of like 110 feet by 170 feet. Right, that's obviously going to be an 11 by 17 ratio, and I'm just going to rotate it real quick. Next step is, of course, make 2D, but maybe actually picking the steps that I want first. So don't get me wrong, that's a lot to look at. Usually that gets me a little bit overwhelmed, and I like to pick my pieces at a time. So I was mentioning maybe we actually start here. That's okay. I'm going to take that piece, copy, right? Or actually maybe take this piece, copy it. Because again, I might mess up and not want to mess that up. I'm going to also take this out of rendered before my computer explodes, because I'm also screen recording and it does take a lot of processing. But that might actually be step 1, and I might need to actually find a perfect view of it. For instance, this is kind of a really big piece. I don't know, I may actually want to make that a little bit smaller and kind of fake it, but I don't know, I might want to actually find the perfect view, and that's actually looking pretty good. I may want to even establish that view and keep that view over and over again. So I'm going to, just because I can. I'm going to right click and make a new, right, save current viewport, and I'm clicked on that viewport. I'm going to call it assignment to view. Of course, spell view correctly. I before E except after C. Anyway, I spelled that wrong, but that's okay. But that's looking like a pretty good view. You'll notice if I click on others, especially if I've moved the object, it's no longer there, right? So just be aware that the camera will stay there, but not the object, right? So that's looking like a pretty good view. I'm going to select everything. I'm going to type in make 2D. Right, I'm going to get my first step. Apply. Of course, it's always going to show up in the top layer. Sweet. Can you imagine how long that would take if we had to do that all the time? Anyway, it's looking kind of big, so I'm going to make it a little bit smaller. And all right, we've already got step 1. To be fair, I want to line up my next piece kind of the same way. So, I don't know, maybe step 2 is actually, I don't know, actually showing this. Or maybe it's actually this with these pieces sort of flying out, right? I don't know. Maybe actually show this as my next piece. So copy. I'm going to put it in a similar spot. In fact, I might even put it in the exact same spot and just get rid of my layer 1, right? Don't have to worry about that so much. Again, I'm going to double click. Oh, don't want to change that one. If you ever do accidentally change them, you can of course right click, set view, and go back to your top view. But in my case, I want to make 2D of this piece, so I'm going to select it, make 2D, enter, and apply. It's going to make that all nice and dandy for us. And bam, step 2. A lot of confusion there, but at least it's got a similar angle now. Even though I did choose a very arbitrary angle, I can still have the same exact angle for each of those pieces, because it might be really confusing to my viewers if, have you ever done this in Studio where you accidentally put the floor plan facing north and you accidentally put the sections facing another way, and maybe put some other things the other way, and your teacher actually or another student thought you meant something else, and it was because you simply kind of just they were in different orientations. In fact, one of the things we'll say in architecture is that they should of course be congruent, right? If you're going to pick one orientation, kind of pick that same orientation over and over again. But that's looking pretty good. Step 2 is great, right? And I will say you can use a step 3 and a final too, right? So in our case, maybe step 3 is that surface. So I'm going to turn my layer back on and maybe get that last piece. So in my case, I think I ended up using something like that. And that's looking pretty wild, but I kind of like it. This sort of exploded, crazy object going on. So I'm going to go, again, I'm just going to copy it real quick from my top view and put it in that same, at least similar spot. In fact, in my case, I may need to actually move it a little bit. I've made multiple copies, and this is basically just a copy. So I may need to actually go to this view and zoom out just a little bit, right? Or double click where I'm at and just scroll over a little bit. Again, retaining that view angle, but just of course panning. So that's looking pretty good. I'm going to take that, and again, can you imagine drafting all this? It would take forever. Maybe I even want the hidden lines. Dang, can you imagine even just clicking a button, getting hidden lines? Looking pretty sweet, and as you can see, it's missing quite a bit of information, right? So maybe this is my third step, and maybe I need to make it a little bit smaller. Of course, holding shift and making that apparent. So we kind of have a step 1, step 2, step 3 going on. And to be fair, if you don't want to accidentally move these and have them not grouped, of course they come in grouped because we had that option to make 2D, but you can also ungroup by typing ungroup or regroup it again by typing group. Anyway, just throwing that out there. But last but not least, you may actually want some shade and shadow to this piece. So I like to introduce this in exercise 2 or assignment 2, and actually we can use a rendered view, right? For instance, I can screenshot this and align my drawing to it. That way I have line weight and I have shade and shadow, and I didn't have to calculate a thing, right? Another thing that we can do is actually control the line or the light or the light type. So in our case, I don't know, maybe I want to get a little bit more fancy with the spices, type in spotlight. I'm going to basically put a light over it and put it at a certain angle, right? And as you can see, it immediately creates some shadows for us. However, it's like the most direct light you've ever seen, so I want to make it a little bit more architectural, right? And as you can see, I'm starting to change the way that the shadow is reacting with the other object. Again, I could just take a screenshot of this and put it underneath, right? Or I can render it out. So you'll see that there's a render option. There's, of course, actually to toggle a render, but then there's also render preview and, of course, render settings. If I click on render settings, of course, it's going to bring up another window, and you can, of course, change a few things. In my case, maybe background color is too much. Maybe it actually needs to be white, and of course, it'll immediately change it to white. Don't get me wrong, sometimes that's helpful, sometimes that's not, right? I mean, almost the white is almost too white. Sometimes I'll even go with a light gray to kind of help myself out in understanding the object. So in my case, I'll select that, and for the sake of time, we'll just start with a screenshot today. But I'll take that screenshot. Something that I could simply put into my my Illustrator or even back into Rhino again. So check this out. We'll go back to our shaded view. We'll go back to our multiple views, and I'll get rid of this rendering preview. One thing you can do is, of course, put it somewhere else, especially if you're in the Mac. You can basically kind of put it as a tab. And I don't really need a material selection, so I'm just going to exit that one if I can. Close display rendering, thank you. Right, I like to keep them all together in one tab. It's a little bit easier that way. I don't know why it doesn't do that by default, but I do know it's a little bit different in the Windows as well. Usually it's just a pop-up separate window. And as you can see, it's really having a hard time finding that little piece right there. Oh, man, it's so close. And it's trying. Anyway, I'm trying to move it, but I guess it's not working for today. But let's get that image in there, right? Along with that make 2D shot that I just put in there, right? So maybe that's my final object, or maybe, you know, this is my final object. Maybe this is what I want to show them. And just to get that final make 2D. Of course, oh, messed it up. I've got to use my middle button to, of course, pan that out a little bit better. Make. And maybe that's my final object. Again, we're not too focused on the design here. Really more of how we express the design. So I don't know. This might be a little too much, right? I may need to actually make this a little bit smaller. Make it off a little bit to the side. And maybe this actually is going to go over here. Maybe all three go over here. I'm not sure. Maybe we use that to take advantage of really the real estate of the page, especially with a funky object. But that's looking pretty good. What I meant by taking in that render, though, is I can type in picture and basically put that screenshot back in. Dymaxion Earth? No, that's not the one I want. Screenshots and recordings. There we go. So we'll take that piece and I'll essentially just line it back up to the original piece. As you can tell, this will take some finesse. However, it's you get used to it. Make sure you hold shift to make it proportional and try to line that up as best as possible. But what's nice is, of course, you can take these images into Illustrator as well. And again, immediately now we have line weight and shade and shadow, just like that, right? So there should be no excuse, right, that you don't have shade and shadow in your three-dimensional objects now, especially since we can make them both so easily and, of course, put them together. Now, don't get me wrong, the hard part is actually getting these to align to each other, right? And you do have to take a little bit of time, but as you can see, it's not too bad, right? Zoom in a little bit more, and that's pretty dang close. But again, might be helpful in maybe even understanding the last object. Of course, I think next time I'll get into a little bit of Illustrator and a little bit of Photoshop, but I know I went over a lot, guys, just to kind of cover it again and to see if there's any questions about it. Obviously, starting off with the box, subtracting 3 random solids, right? And so, of course, making those 3 solids. Some people ask, you know, can it be the same object? Yeah, that's fine too. You know, if you want to make it congruent and you want to make it a little less chaotic, then obviously it can become. The reason mine is so chaotic is because I'm trying to show you like 3 different things, by the way. You don't have to make it chaotic. In fact, I've seen some really beautiful outcomes out of this process, so please don't make it like mine, right? We basically subtracted. We added some pipe-like elements. Again, same things. It doesn't have to be crazy like that. And then, of course, we created some surfaces to dice it in half. So, not too shabby there. And then really using the exact same process in order to diagram. I threw in a little bit of extra with the shade and shadow and a spotlight. Again, for some of us who maybe want to be pushed a little bit more, right, in terms of the projects. But other than that, guys, any questions for today? For the most part, pretty clear. Well, you can use a render. I just, for the sake of speed, I just took a screenshot because the rendered view was nice enough. To answer your question, though, no, you can basically just render it out, right? So, for instance, if I right-click, I go to render settings. Well, it's going to be over here. Oh, I accidentally got rid of it. How funny. There's the render settings. We'll go over this at another date, but if you wanted to get started, you can see that we can change our resolution. I mean, we can make it like 4K, you know, but it's going to take like an hour to render it out. Let's try 2K. My computer's pretty fast, so it should be okay. I'll do a good quality. You can even change the environment. You can load these, by the way. So like you can click on the plus sign. There's basic environments. You can download environments. You can literally I mean, it is pretty crazy. We'll get into that when we get into it. But when you hit render, it's actually going to turn it into an image. I just did the screenshot because, again, it's way faster than this, right? But if you do want something of high quality, for sure, you're definitely going to use the rendering process. But as you can see, it's also using too much light right now. If I zoom in, you can tell it's pretty clear, that's for sure. Definitely, arguably a lot more clear than that screenshot that I took, but again, excuse me, it's going to take a little bit of a process. Good question, though. But yeah, we can instantly save that once it's finished. Actually, it's pretty close. 448 frames out of 500. We're almost done. And once it is done, then you can actually hit save, right? We can save it as a JPEG or actually quite a few images. So, not sure what a Rhino rendered image is, but I'll test it out later. Good question, though. Any others, guys?
You want shade shadow on all the objects? Or
Doesn't have to be on all the objects. In fact, in most cases, especially like Ellis, forget that part, right? But if you want to go above and beyond, absolutely. Absolutely. Good questions. Any else, guys? Well, I would say it is 9:30, and let's try to at least go to 10:20 today, working class. Ask me questions, flag me down if you do have some specific questions. Otherwise, I'll end it there for today.